Hey, welcome back to Ecommerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Today, we've got a brand that is pretty close to my heart. So this season, we've been doing athleisure, and today we are covering Gymshark. But for those that are tuning in for the first time, Aaron, do you want to give a quick overview of what Ecommerce on Tap is?
Yeah, so basically every episode we take a well-known venture-backed company, typically, and we tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and talk about their X potential. It's a lot of fun. It's meant to kind of educate as well as be entertaining, but it's really kind of one of the highlights of my week for sure.
Yeah, and today, Gymshark is just one of the fastest growing athleisure brands. Their founding story is just incredible. I'm really excited to dive in here. But before we kick this off, were there any interesting tidbits that caught your eye? I know we, of course, been going, really just keeping an eye on the news with all the tariffs and everything happening with that. And, I guess just to make a note, we are recording this on April 24th, 2025. So if tariff news happens tomorrow, I'm sorry we haven't seen it yet, but we've definitely been keeping an eye on the
Man,
news.
tariffs are old news, man. I mean, they're gonna, are they here? Are they not here? I don't even know. But I think on that front, it looks like the stage has been set for a very large free trade agreement between India and the U.S., which will have major ramifications. I think there's a conscious decision to try to move uh, our manufacturing base as America, not only to the U.S. but most likely to India as the source of most of those products. And so, if a deal can get done, I think that would be really interesting. But the piece that really caught my eye was this announcement by the FDA to ban most artificial colors. Did you see this?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of a big deal. I mean, there's artificial coloring in a lot of stuff that's been used for a long time. And I actually went way deep on this yesterday and have an article that came out on LinkedIn if people want to check it out. But basically, what we've done is we basically said that, hey, these artificial colors, we don't want them in our food anymore. And so there's a focus to getting rid of these artificial colors by 2026. And so relatively short time frame, especially when you think about, okay, I've got all this inventory. I've got to reformulate all my products. I've got to make sure this works. I've got to produce it. So it's a pretty aggressive timeline from that perspective. But this move really brings the U.S. in line with most other markets around the world. Artificial coloring was banned in some countries starting in the 80s and the 90s, and so the U.S. is pretty late to the game in this sense. But it's really what was fascinating to me was what's going to happen next. And so what you're going to see is this massive rush on reformulations. Every large food company, every small company is going to have to go through and reformulate their products, and there are just simply not enough natural colorants out there to do it. I mean, in some cases, we're going to need 5x the amount of different types of roots and things like that we'll go through. And so there'll be a push on this. There will be costs that go up just until that supply chain can be recognized. But if you had to guess which color is going to be the most difficult to see in maybe 18 to 24 months, what do you think it would be?
That's a good question. I don't know. My gut says red, but who knows?
You get a lot of red from like beetroots and stuff like that, but actually blues is going to be the hardest thing. And so I think you'll if you start looking at Fruit Loops or other things like that, they're going to be a different color, or they're not going to be as blue as they have been, just because that's a difficult color to make and to hold. And of course, when you've got these natural dyes, you've got to think about the pH and do these dyes fade in sunlight? What's the half life of them? All those sorts of things. So there's a lot of things, and this is going to be a pretty monumental change that's happening as a result of this decision.
Yeah, it's. I think it's pretty incredible on the health front. I know the EU already bans a lot of these dyes, so I think it's great that we're catching up to that in the US.
There was one red color. I forget exactly which one it was, but the FDA has said that it was harmful to put in lipstick and cosmetics, and so it's been banned for about 15 years. But it was still allowed to go in food.
It's crazy. Sometimes you look at regulation and you definitely question a lot of things. I was pretty impressed by, I've been continuously impressed by this kind of convergence of creators in commerce. And what caught my eye the past week was Hailey Bieber's Rhode Cosmetics, which just launched in 2022, has hired JP Morgan to explore a sale at a target price of over $1 billion. So, I mean, to launch a brand to $1 billion exit in 3 years, that's just
Not bad.
insane to think about. And the brand is generating over 200 million in revenue and run by the ex CEO of the Honest Company. So, just incredible to see the growth of these creator-led brands, and it sounds like this is going to be a very successful exit for the Road team.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, three years to $1 billion is pretty great. If Haley's listening, if you want to come on the podcast, we'll make an exception. You're welcome to be on.
Totally. Well,
But
before we dive into Gymshark, I got to make a quick note. Everyone that's tuning in, if you have a friend in e-commerce and you haven't told them to subscribe to e-commerce on tap, take a second and tell them to subscribe right now. Share it with them on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We've been hearing from people that, these stories are the highlight of their week and they're learning a lot. And so we want to make sure that more people, more of your friends learn from e-commerce on tap. So take a second right now and share with a friend. Now, onto the Gymshark story. So this, Gymshark to me is just one of those brands that it's incredible because on one hand, I feel like I had so many friends that tried to start a clothing brand through like middle school and high school and even college. And they tried and, sold some shirts. Some of them had cool designs. But, with this story and the founder, Ben Francis, I mean, this has become now a multi-billion-dollar brand that was basically started in his college dorm room, right? I mean, and I think if you look at what they've created as a whole, it really emphasizes their kind of tribe mentality and the timing in terms of leaning into influencers. So, I mean, they've done this just incredible job of creating, digitally native growth and relentless community building and just being very bold along the way. And so, I mean, let's just start. Like, who is the founder of Gymshark and how did they get started?
yeah, it's a great question. So we have to go back to 2012. Let's just imagine what the world was like. Shopify was new. Instagram was kind of just getting started. But Ben Francis was 19 years old at Ashton University in the UK. And at the time, Ben was going to college. He was doing classes. He was working as a delivery driver at Pizza Hut. And he was coding websites on the side. And that's really what his passion was. That's what he enjoyed doing. And so he had this natural entrepreneurial drive since before he knew how to code. And he had one of his first websites was helping people to sell license plates in the UK. And he had lots of different fitness apps and web apps and things like that. But in 2012, he decided to launch one called Gymshark. And he launched Gymshark initially as a dropshipping company for supplements. But he quickly realized that, these margins were not very good for dropshipping. And, it was enough to kind of still give them some cash and start to get going. But they recognized very quickly they wanted to do something else. They wanted to kind of lean into fitness wear.
Yeah, and I mean, it kind of sounds like almost that early stage of so many companies we hear about where you're pivoting, trying to figure out, what you should actually build. And there's kind of a moment here where he could have doubled down and tried to create his own supplements because, in general, if you're not just drop shipping other people's supplements have very high margins. But, it seems like he was really kind of going through that art of the pivot and just trying to figure out, what should I build and create here. And I guess I'm curious, just to kick off the conversation, Aaron, at what point do you think a founder should kind of stop pivoting and be like, hey, this is what I should build?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I mean, who knows if he would have stuck with the supplement piece, if we'd be telling a story and it would have started to say like, hey, it was really bad for 10 years, but then they made it and look at them now, right? You could have those sorts of stories you hear them all the time. I think that a lot of this comes down to what is the how much money does the founder let themselves make? And what I mean by that is there are some founders where they're like, man, if I made $1 million, I wouldn't know what to do, right? That's success in that. And you've got other founders who say, if I can't, do $100 million business here, I'm not interested in this. And so I think that you start to look at this, you start to say no to some deals, and you start to look and say yes to other deals, and that's what motivates you. And I think that subconsciously or consciously, Ben was looking at this and saying, you know what, I know that I can make thousands of dollars or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this drop shipping thing at scale. but I think I can do more. I want to do a lot more. And so from that analysis, it was probably a pretty easy decision to say I've got I'd have to sell 50,000 units in order to make the same amount as selling 500 of this apparel. So maybe I'll go do that. But I mean, how do you see that? What do you think?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think in general it's best to lean into problems that you've faced yourself. And so I think a lot of times along this pivot journey, many founders, go after cool ideas or things that sound very innovative, but maybe they aren't solving a problem they've faced themselves. And I think a lot of great businesses stem from frustration, right?
Mm.
And so, for me, I think even along the journey of Sourcify, when we started in 2017, people originally thought that Sourcify name, it could resonate with, of course, supply chain, but also some people thought, oh, do you do recruiting, right? Do you do overseas recruiting for talent? You're sourcing candidates. And, I obviously didn't have any recruiting experience. I had a ton of supply chain experience having lived in China. And so I just, really saw the problem firsthand, having lived in China and ran my own e-commerce businesses of, hey, it's really hard to find a factory in Asia that you trust and that, you can manage the production process through and manage quality control and handle freight. And so, that's what I leaned into because it was a personal pain point I had faced in the past. And I think too, if you look at Ben and just the founding story of Gymshark, he loved lifting, right? He had a passion for lifting, and he felt like he couldn't really find that aesthetic in the gym that he was looking for when it came to apparel. And so, he spent the €1,000 that he had saved delivering pizzas basically and bought a sewing machine and a screen printer and started making clothes by himself and with the help of his friend Lewis Morgan. And so his grandmother was actually the one that helped him learn to sew. And they were the ones that created Gymshark's first apparel line. And so, Ben himself spent hours and hours just iterating, printing different logos and sewing and, trying to understand how they want, the sleeves cut and the shoulders sized and, really finding those first patterns to work along. And
I
if you
love
look at
that.
their
I think that there's just this idea that, like you were saying, focus on what is your pain point. And I wonder if there was a conversation here in his mind, at least, where he says, hey, I don't have stuff that I like to wear at the gym. I know how to sew. Let me go out and make it and see if other people got it. But yeah, I guess, how did they go from that dorm piece into like the broader launch of what we know today?
Yeah, I mean, the real break for them came at the Body Power Expo in 2013. So this was a pretty big fitness trade show in Birmingham, and they just had incredible audience response there. So in the first 30 minutes of the show, they sold 30,000 euros of inventory. And from there, Gymshark, didn't just grow, it really just exploded onto the market. And Ben had gone to the expo previously and found that most stands were pretty boring, and so he emptied his bank account and reached out to a manufacturer for their initial kind of Luxe tracksuit. And it's actually pretty cool if you Google their Body Power Expo 2013, you can see their team in all these Luxe tracksuits posing in front of their booth. And so they just got flooded by buyers, and that continued on to their second expo. And they just continued to grow and grow, and they would load the remaining products on their website. And just, kind of organically through the community that they started to build, they just kind of were always trying to keep up with inventory in the early days. And it seems like this kind of just fast rise overnight in terms of their growth. But, there was a lot of issues, of course, when you face this growth in terms of keeping up with inventory, managing your supply chain, and, trying to understand what do you produce next.
Yeah, and I think as you talk about this meteoric growth, I think that there's sometimes this perception that when these companies have this sort of dramatic rise, that they didn't have it, they got everything right. There weren't any issues. And I think that the reality is that every company faces issues when they're growing. You just are very selective about which issues you're going to fight, which ones you're not going to. And so, I would imagine that they didn't spend a whole lot of time arguing about which financial accounting system they were going to use, right? or they probably spent a lot of time on like branding or messaging or making sure that they had enough inventory. And so I think that the element here that really made them successful was being able to focus on the core pieces of what you need to do for a rapidly scaling business. It's making sure that you have enough inventory, maybe not to sell to satisfy all the demand, but to make sure you've got the momentum, you get enough cash coming in. Like it's really about maintaining that cash and making sure that you're not outlaying cash faster than you're getting it in, and you can kind of get it going through there. But I think if you just manage cash, all the other stuff has a way of working itself out.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things that I've seen brands implement is around their cash, right? Around their cash conversion cycle and trying to, in the early days, get terms with their suppliers. So a lot of times, let's say you get, net 120 with your supplier, you really build a strong relationship with them. You can a lot of times potentially sell that inventory before you even have to pay for it, which is just an incredible position to be in as a fast growing brand. So, I think Gymshark tried to lean into that when it came to negotiating with their suppliers and understood in the early days, hey, we don't have the cash to, spend on inventory before, we can't pay this up front, right? And so I think they really try to lean into negotiating with their suppliers and making sure, they had good terms from the early days because, without that, when it comes to high growth, you're really going to be struggling to manage your balance sheet.
Yeah, completely. Was there anything special or unique about the Gymshark early product, or what was so exciting for people to want to buy so much of this so quickly?
Yeah, I think in general, before Gymshark, I think that community didn't necessarily find clothing that was really form fitting and functional and stylish to wear lifting, right? And it kind of reminds me a little bit if you remember the Lululemon story or Aloe Yoga story that we did in terms of them, really creating clothing that connects with people that go to yoga a lot and that, is very functional. And so I think Gymshark realized, hey, there's very little functional clothing for lifters out there that they enjoy wearing. And they also used this kind of polyester spandex blend that was, more stretchy and breathable and moisture wicking than, just kind of your regular cotton t-shirt. And so I think, in general, they tried to just create clothing that was great to lift in, and their audience, definitely resonated with that because, I mean, what really powered their growth here?
Well, I think, keep in mind when this is early 2010s. And so Instagram was still relatively new, and Ben had the foresight to say, let's lean into it, right? And we've talked about how there are so many multi-hundred million, multi-billion dollar companies that came up with, that grew up with Instagram and were able to have that initial outreach. And so they lean into that, and they became synonymous with this new generation of fitness influencers. So they really were working with people who weren't in the glossy magazines, Men's Health or things like that, but really people who were posting sweaty selfies, workout tips, things like that. And Ben was a lifter and had reached out to a lot of these influencers himself and just sent them Gymshark products. And at the time, nobody knew what to call this, but we now know this is influencer marketing. And their early success was really coupled with these influencer partnerships and a near obsessive focus on the brand aesthetic. And so they didn't really work with A-list celebrities. They had some fitness mega influencers like Whitney Simmons and David Lane. And when they worked with those sorts of people who I had to Google who they were, but if you know, you know. And when those sorts of people give you a recommendation, it just feels so much more authentic and real as opposed to, maybe Tom Brady selling the Hertz commercial.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so I think they leaned into influencers that their community looked up to. And I mean, if you Google David Lade as an example, I mean, his audience is just so engaged and a lot bigger than people would think, right? I mean, he is, basically an A-list celebrity within the fitness niche and category. And I think one other thing that stuck out to me in terms of their strategy for growth, which a lot of people would be like, in today's world, they'd be like, well, does this scale, right? I don't want to host in real life events, but their in real life events, really doubled as a backdrop for their kind of influencer community to just create this vibe that it's not like an expo per se, but it's a kind of more, hang out in the park with your mates and, maybe do some exercises and stretches and, just kind of meet each other. And so this kind of Gymshark World Tour that they created just was this huge kind of social media driven meetup in real life that, they would drop a location, and sometimes it would be in Times Square to, Grafton Street in Dublin, and they would just create these meetups around the world fueled by, their social media audience. And, this would later turn into even bigger events that they titled We Lift the City. And it would just, create this incredible in-person community that, oftentimes I think people don't talk to each other in the gym, but I think when you would go to like a We Lift the City event, it's more of a community driven, let's meet each other, hey, we both obviously like to work out, and we we connect with, the Gymshark apparel and the vibe. And so, I think it's just pretty incredible to see. And Gymshark is also for females as well. So they launched their women's line in 2014, which accounted for about 2/3 of their revenue in 2022. And so the initial female products, as you can imagine, were not great because it's a male founded company. But they've, quickly learned how to build great, female fitness apparel.
Yeah, I think it's they had those great things. I think you're right. Like merging that online and offline piece was so smart because it helps reinforce the influencers, get a bunch of micro influencers going, and it's just really smart, for my opinion. I think one of the things that really stuck out to me is this founder. And so sometimes you hear about startups who outgrow a founder, and usually that means that the founder is exited from the business. But it's very rare that a founder will recognize that the company has outgrown them and decide to take a step backwards. And so I want to dive into the story because I think it's just so fascinating.
Yeah, I think you need to have, you need to be humble as a founder to realize, hey, am I the best fit person to be CEO here? And so in 2015, the brand was growing so fast. And, this was only what, like, I think 3 years after they launched. And Ben Francis, the founder, made kind of a unprecedented decision to step down as CEO. And he cited his own lack of operational experience to manage a scaling brand. And so he stepped away from the CEO role and, really focused more on product development and branding and just kind of marketing in general. And he brought in Steve Hewitt, who was the former Reebok executive. And, I think Ben's goal was to kind of take a step back to learn and develop before eventually taking back over as CEO, which he did in 2021. And so I think you really have to be mature as a CEO, as a founder, to understand, hey, am I the best person suited for this role, especially as they're growing so fast? And I really don't think that many founders could do this, right? And I think in today's world too, with startups, a lot of times if you hear about a founding CEO stepping back, maybe they're burnt out or tired, but this was really just like, 2.5, 3 years after they founded the brand. So it was a pretty, I think, smart decision for him to realize that. And you really need to be mature as a founder to do that. And I just wonder, for you, what does this tell you about kind of Ben's character and mentality, right?
Yeah, and for context here, it's not as if Gymshark in 2015 was doing $200 million in revenue. It was doing about 8.7 million pounds. So a relatively small company, not a tiny company by any stretch of imagination, but not the juggernaut that we know today. And look, I mean, the guy was 22 years old at the time, so perhaps he's like, hey, I need to go to college. I need to do some other stuff. I want to go figure other things out. But it's so atypical because how often do you hear people talk about, oh, Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard and he's been CEO ever since, and he'll be CEO till he dies. And that's just kind of the ethos that we've built around founders. And to say that you don't have to do that, you can still be a founder and still be involved in the business, but have other people making other decisions. I think you're right. I think it shows amazing maturity, and I think it shows that Ben really felt that he needed to grow, and he gave himself space to grow. And the results here were just kind of amazing. So if you think about they brought in this Reebok guy, Steve Hewitt, and he was CEO from basically till like 2020. And his focus was to build a senior leadership team. So, getting a lot of C-suite titles and folks in there, expanding international operations, focusing on like the back end, logistics, all these things that Ben said he wasn't very good at. And Ben was taking that time to prepare himself to learn to kind of have this shadow CEO role. And in 2020, Gymshark raised their first ever funding from General Athletic, who I think bought a 21% stake. The value of the company about $1 billion. And so you think about this, and he is still along for the ride here. And you've got somebody who maybe the investors knew already, right? He didn't have to go through and figure out how to do venture capital first time. It de-risked it for the investors to some extent, where he said, "Hey, yeah, we'll put money behind this." And Francis himself owned 70% during the transaction, and so he has control of the company. But it's like the perfect outcome here because, effectively he's still working with the business. He doesn't have to do all of the decisions. He has to worry about the parts that he's not good at, and his stake is worth 700 million pounds. And so it's just amazing how it goes through. And so when Francis takes over as CEO again in August of 2021, Hewitt becomes executive president. And Francis says, like, look, I had an informal CEO apprenticeship. He was able to oversee global brand strategy. And he really became not just a founder taking over because he was jealous, but he really became groomed and ready for this, where I'm sure the investors were thrilled with it. And during that time, Hewitt scaled the business from 8.7 million pounds in 2015 to 402 million pounds in 2021. So just an amazing trajectory. And I think, we should do a whole episode or an interview with Steve at some point if we could get him. But it's just remarkable kind of that growth and having the right person in the right place at the right time. I mean, have you heard of anybody else doing this? I mean, should more founders be exploring this sort of thing, looking at these kind of results?
It's a really, really great question. In my opinion, I think it's a smart move, right? But you also hear the other side of the story too, in terms of, you bring in some executives and they don't want to get their hands dirty, and, the brand or company doesn't go anywhere, right? And so I think it's impressive for them to be able to have done this at the scale that they were at when they did it. And just to see that growth trajectory, is incredible. It goes to show that Hewitt brought in the right team. He really continued to build that community that Gymshark is so known for. And I mean, I think it's a really just unique strategy that you need to have a lot of perspective on from the early days. And especially as a young founder like Ben, when he started this, I mean, it's just pretty remarkable to see him pull this off and to see him then, step back in as CEO.
Yeah, I think if there was one message I could take away from this, it's that it's okay for a founder to ask for help, right? And I think that can come in lots of different forms. It could be a shadow CEO apprenticeship like we had here with Gymshark, but it could be having a coach, having a cohort, having consultants or advisors or things like that. And I think that if you think you can do it alone, you're not going to be able to go. I mean, what's the African parable? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with somebody. And I think that that's just a great example here of what they were doing. And just kudos to both Steve and Ben for having the humility, as you talked about, to go out and do this.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, under Hewitt's leadership, so they first entered the US market in 2017 with a pop-up store in Soho. And by 2022, America was Gymshark's largest market. And I mean, I think it's, a lot of brands try to enter either from the US to the UK or UK to US because of obviously shared language. But in reality, the culture and logistics and just commercialization of these markets is a lot different. And so, I'm curious, Aaron, from your perspective and, just research on Gymshark too, what are some of the key differences between the US and UK market in e-commerce?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to do a bit of a bonus episode here inside this episode and just talk about international expansion, because this is something that we've done a lot with. In fact, one of my first projects when I was starting ISBA was helping Kind Bar expand their D2C operation from the US into the UK. And so certainly a crash course in all this. But let me just go through and walk through some basic parameters of how the UK and the US e-commerce ecosystems are different. So the first piece is looking at market size and acquisition costs. So the US market is about 5 times larger, but it's also so much more competitive. This is the market where if people are starting a brand, this is where you want to be. Biggest consumer market, people like to order on e-commerce. And so as a result, the CACs in the United States are roughly 2 to 3 times higher than what they are in the UK. A lot of times when we have UK brands coming to the US, their eyes fall out of their head when they see the acquisition costs. And they underestimate just that amount of marketing spend that's required to compete and be successful in the US. When it comes to messaging and customer expectations, in the UK, there is more of a premium on polished, price sensitivity, loyalty is something that builds slowly over time. Whereas in the US, bold branding, think Liquid Death, having this emotional appeal, this service and speed orientation, that will get a lot of people to come over. And so in the UK, people are typically more loyal, but takes more time to get over there. Whereas the US, show us a shiny ad and tell us a cool story, and we'll probably try the product. From a marketing and sales perspective, in the UK, Instagram, YouTube, and influencer marketing feel a lot more grassroots. So Gymshark's a really good example of that. But in the US, you see Meta, TikTok, it's much more performance heavy. And so influencers are more commercialized. And so, there's whole ecosystems and marketplaces we can go through to get quote unquote organic paid influencer marketing. Some other interesting differences is in the UK, it's much more of a debit first payment system. And buy now, pay later is very, very common. So you've got a lot of things like Klarna Afterpay that are well adopted. In the US, it's credit card first. And buy now, pay later is available, but it's not as big as it is in the UK. And so this is like kind of a big issue for brands that are expanding from the US into Europe in particular, is if you try to running on recharge, right? They use credit cards. I don't know if they do this now, but when we were expanding Hubble into Europe, they didn't handle debit cards. And so you kind of had no way to do subscription revenue and things like that. And then the last big thing I would point to is like the regulatory considerations. So the UK obviously has GDPR. It's very privacy focused, and so that you have to be careful about what data you're using, what you're getting, what you're able to have, give people the right to be forgotten, and you have to make sure that returns are very simple and very straightforward. Whereas the US, we don't have those privacy concerns, and you have to think about all the different patchworks of state regulations, sales tax, labeling, things like that. So there's a lot there that you can kind of get into.
Yeah, I mean, the sales tax alone is just crazy when it comes to e-commerce. I mean, I know Numeral very well, and they're one of the e-commerce leaders when it comes to sales tax. And, just seeing the back-end systems that they had to build to, really make it seamless to spend less than 5 minutes a month on sales taxes. It's a lot of work to just even handle sales tax in every state, and there's different nexuses and thresholds and everything per state, and something that you don't really think about when you're starting an e-commerce brand in America. But as you grow, it really, really becomes a burden. What about the logistics kind of difference between the US and the UK?
Yeah, that's a great question. So UK is obviously a smaller country, and so you can get by with one warehouse that services the entire country, and you can have pretty good distribution and speed across the entire UK. US, you typically need multi-node fulfillment to have a 2-day expectation. And returns are much more complex and expensive in the US as a result. Things have to go much farther. You may only have one return location, and then you've still got to deal with it, so that's difficult. I think one of the bigger difference is the difference in the delivery location preferences. So in the UK, people still do have home delivery, but the consumers demand more flexible or secure alternatives. So this might be parcel lockers or a click and collect at a local shop or things like that. They also want the ability to pick it, have their parcel at work. And this is in large part driven by the fact that in general, the UK has much smaller living spaces with shared entrances. And so you wouldn't just leave a package on a doorstep because it could be for a whole number of people. And there's also a higher concern around missed deliveries or threats or things like that. And so there's quite a few parcel locker networks and other things that have been set up in the UK to facilitate that. In the US, home delivery is really the default, where people will just drop it off on the doorstep, and that's that. And most deliveries don't require someone to be there to sign. And there are things like Amazon Locker and other access points that are starting to gain traction. But by and large, it's more of a novelty versus just, oh yeah, let me go there and pick it up. And the US has this phenomenon of porch piracy, which doesn't really exist in the UK as a result of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy to see the differences and just talk through them. And I think it's not, I mean, it really, in my opinion, is kind of the U.S. and the EU, right? It's not necessarily just U.S. and UK. I think a lot of brands that expand to the UK, they also want to, sell through the EU. And Europe in general is obviously much denser, smaller streets. You don't see F-150s driving down the streets. And there's obviously different languages throughout the EU. So it's always going to be different. But I guess real quick, is there any kind of parcel logistics that brands need to be aware of real quick?
Yeah, I touched on it briefly, but the signature and just having someone there to pick up the package is actually a big difference. So most deliveries in the UK require a signature and someone to be home, right, to give that signature. And so that's especially true for carriers like Royal Mail, DPT, or Hermes. If you're not there, then they often leave a sorry we missed you card, and they will reroute the package to a collection point. And so it'll be like, hey, you weren't here, so it's down at your corner store. Go to Boots, go pick it up over here. In the US, that's not the case, right? So if you're not there, they're just going to leave it at your door. Having a note left is something that people would be like, this is weird. Why'd you do that? And so it's very different.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, I mean, kind of getting back to Gymshark here, Gymshark, one of the biggest stats that stood out to me was they cracked the US market originally before even, having a team here, right? So they reached $200 million in revenue in America before they even had US based staff. So the early traction really just came from this digital first approach with the remote operations, and they leaned into influencer led marketing like Nikki Blackadder, who built trust and credibility locally, and they definitely continued to do their community driven growth. Like they created campaigns like 66 days change your life to foster engagement. And I think at the end of the day, when I look at their U.S. expansion, and just growth, it really stems from tribe over being transactional, and they've really leaned into creating this tribe. They had localized US messaging like United We Sweat campaigns. And, they only, established their US kind of base after they proved it digitally, right? And so they have a Gymshark headquarters in Denver, actually, which I thought was a pretty unique location. I don't know if there was any reason to Denver, but it stood out to me. And they've hosted, tons of in real life events there, as well as, through major cities like lift New York City. So I don't know. Do you know why they chose Denver?
Denver's a great city. I think it's a pretty active one as well. Sometimes this comes down to the person they wanted to hire wanted to live in Denver, and so that's where they were.
Maybe they just love to ski and snowboard. We'll see Gymshark on the mountain soon or something. But I think it's pretty interesting because to you, what can other brands learn about their international expansion? Obviously this is going UK to US, but I think there's notes that can be derived from either way you look at it.
Yeah, and again, $200 million without a US employee. That is remarkable, right? And so I think they did a couple key things that were right. The first one is that they localized the marketing, so they didn't just copy and paste what was working in the UK and assume that it was going to work in the US. That is important, regardless of which side you're going on. So you got to localize your content. The next piece is they planned their budget accordingly to account for those CACs that were 3 times higher. And then they started to hire local expertise, partner with US based operators. So you can get very, very far with consultancy like ISBA, or finding the right people who can help you go between these markets, but really relying on other teams who are there and know that well before building that capacity yourself is a good thing. I think you can also start regionally. So perhaps rather than taking the entire US, they focused on Texas or California, and they just let the culture lead their expansion as opposed to not just the language. So what I mean by that is they could have said, all right, well, there is a lot of English speaking in Kenya. Let's go to Kenya. But they looked at that and said, well, is there a sufficient weightlifting culture? Is there something here that is going to really resonate with what we're trying to do as a brand ethos? And so that was really the key thing that they looked at, was not just where was it easy, where do people read the same language that we have, but really where can we export this culture that we've been developing, this community, so that people feel like they are part of something that's bigger than they are.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think that really kind of ties into their financial milestones and timelines. So, just to give a quick overview, Gymshark was launched in 2012 out of Ben's parents' garage. 2013 is when they sold $30,000 in product in one day at the Body Power Expo. 2016, they're about 45 million euros in sales. 2018, over 100 million. 2019, they doubled to about 219 million. And then 2020 is when they bring on their first outside investor. So, as you mentioned, Aaron, General Atlantic valued the company at $1.3 billion, about a billion euros at the time. They bought a 21% stake in the business. And, I think too, they kind of dove in and kind of pinpointed, where are most of these Gymshark customers coming from? And the migration, a lot of times, of these people moved, they were moving from Lululemon customers or Fabletics customers to Gymshark customers, which I thought was pretty interesting. And they just continue on this incredible growth trajectory, right? So 2021, they reached over 400 million euros. 2022, over 500 million euros with an estimated EBITDA margin about 10 to 15%. And they opened up their first brick and mortar store on Regent Street in London in 2022. And then 2023, they've surpassed 600 million euros and employ over 850 staff worldwide. So, I mean, just a pretty incredible trajectory over a 10-year time span to go from 0 to 600 plus million euros in sales and continue to grow internationally. I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
Completely. Yeah. So pretty remarkable growth here. It's just, and again, I think it comes back to the founder and being able to have Steven there and getting the right team on board. Their supply chain is interesting, but what does their basic footprint look like?
Yeah, so I mean, they obviously don't own their own factories. They use contract manufacturers, primarily in Asia. Their products are designed in the UK, but manufactured through a network of suppliers across Asia. So mainly China, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. I've actually been to many Canton fairs where you have athleisure suppliers that have Gymshark looking clothing in their booths. They try not to keep the logos on there, but you can hint at it as a lot of their account reps do. And so within Asia, they've really tried to diversify their supply chain with different suppliers in Sri Lanka and Vietnam and Bangladesh following close, but more than half their imports are directly linked to apparel. And so I can only imagine what they're feeling right now with the tariffs going on and everything like that. But at least they do have a diversified supply chain base around Asia.
Yeah, I would imagine they're feeling pretty good about the U.S. only being 20-ish% of their revenue, and they got the rest of the world they can focus on. I think the thing that's interesting too, and we talked about this last week on the Aloe episode, was just you've got all of these factories that are producing basically the same stuff with slight variations for all these major athleisure brands. And so really it comes down to how do you protect your brand and make sure that there is some difference there and you're not going to be tied up in some bad report where something bad's going on in your factory, right? What are some of the things that Gymshark does in order to help protect their brand?
Yeah, I think they really try to align in terms of understanding the sustainability measures that they could put in place. They, I think, do a good job of checking to see if these supply chain partners embed their ethical standards and environmental standards. They monitor with different adoption programs like HIGFEM, third-party audits, FLA visits, FSLM, and they also have kind of whistleblower calls, which is kind of unique and interesting. And so they do have a Gymshark factory visit program where they periodically go visit their suppliers throughout Southeast Asia. And so, they also publish a list of factories they work with, which I thought was, pretty unique. And so you can look up some of the main suppliers that Gymshark works with, which I think, more and more brands are doing, which I think is very unique and interesting. Because in the past, you would see companies, hide their factory base, and now they're being more transparent about that. And I think that's, in general, a positive for consumers. And I think the realization for them is that, hey, anyone can go produce any type of athleisure product, but not everyone can produce this product with the Gymshark, look and feel and aesthetic and obviously the brand. And so, I think actually it's smarter for them to do that, because it just instills, I think, more brand loyalty and identity and saying, hey, we have nothing to hide here. And so I think that's, really important and interesting for more and more brands to do nowadays.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think I could argue both sides of it, right? Because on the one hand, if you are producing something as basically a commodity, then it doesn't really matter if I say, "Hey, I get my socks from Walmart," right? You're kind of like, "Oh, okay, yeah, cool, me too." But if you've got something that's truly proprietary or unique, that one might be one that you would hold a little bit close to the vest, or you would basically just know that that factory has no capacity, and you're such a big part of their business that you're going to basically be able to say yes and no to any prospective brands that they're working with. So I think that there's like elements and ways to do it. I don't know if it's completely altruism, but it's an interesting piece there.
So, I mean, I agree with that too. And then if you look at their kind of supply chain strategy overall and how they've staffed it, I mean, that's been pretty interesting to see as well, right?
Well, yeah, and also how they chose not to staff it. So that's been an interesting wrinkle I looked at. So from the beginning, there were several people who talked about how important it was that Gymshark have a back end that was as robust as the front end. Right? They talked about how having good IT systems was not going to help them have a strong brand, but it was the foundation that helped them sustain their strong brand. That being said, they didn't have a dedicated supply chain leader or officer until December 22, when they hired a former Lacoste EVP named Laurent Madeleine. And he was really kind of part of that aggressive senior level recruitment that Steve and Ben were leading. And it started to be the beginning of kind of this new transition here for what's there. But part of those here is they did have people who were looking after operations, but it wasn't a C-suite function until very, very late, really after their fundraise even, um, to get there. So that was a particularly interesting thing for me.
Yeah, and then from a logistics front, I mean, they just operated their supply chain super lean. So, as they expanded to the US, they opened up a US distribution center in 2021 to speed up delivery and reduce costs. And, during peak COVID, I saw one of the kind of interesting tidbits here was they chartered its own cargo flights to bypass delays, which was, a bold move at the time, but in order to maintain service levels while their competitors struggled, that's what they stepped up and did. And in 2022, they rolled out an RFID inventory management and predictive analytics system to just better, understand demand, which, probably during COVID, like most of these athleisure brands, they saw a huge spike in sales. And so, I think it was a mixture of, keeping up with inventory demands to charter that flight, as well as to bypass some of the delays that came to importing products into the U.S. during that time with just how slammed customs was and everything. And so they've done a lot now, I think, strategically to try to better manage their supply chain. But if you look at the size and scope of Gymshark, you would think they would have done that a lot sooner than they actually did. And now, I mean, people have discussed and talked about potential exit strategies for Gymshark. What came to mind or caught your eye when you were looking at, is Gymshark going to go public soon? I'm sure you saw those headlines too.
Yeah, I think that the investor, so General Atlantic, is probably the one that's on the clock here. So venture funds typically want to get a return on their investments every 7 to 10 years. And again, they purchased 21% in 2020, and they're probably looking for an exit in the next 24 to 36 months, if you just look at that timeline. There have been rumors that Gymshark is considering an IPO in London, but there are no formal steps that have been announced. So this IPO would put them alongside like Lulu and On Running in terms of like public athleisure players, although we talked about maybe Aloe will come out in the future. But you look at this and they've really done a good job building a company that someone else would want to buy. And they've got a lot of just strength with their millennial brand. So they're incredibly strong with Gen Zs, and just that's an interesting demographic that someone may want to have. They've got good D2C first economics, high repeat rates of purchasing. They've only only 50% of their sales come from outside the UK, so there's high upside for for that business to continue to grow outside of the UK. And their fulfillment infrastructure is relatively tech forward, and so they're doing a good job there. So I think that they are starting to look at that. If you think about valuations, uh, their fundraise was about 2 to 3x revenue when they got the $1 billion valuation. So right now it'd be probably a 1.4 to 2.2 billion dollar exit if that was the IPO route that they were going to go through. But they could also just be in the ballpark for an acquisition, and so it's an interesting piece that way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think they're going to continue to grow. Like you said, there's a lot more international expansion they can do. They can open up a lot more of a physical presence elsewhere in the world. And so, I think they're going to continue to grow. And I think that valuation is going to be a bit higher, but, we definitely will see. And I think you're right to think that, General Atlantic has a timeline here. They need to return capital to their LPs at some point. And, it's been obviously kind of on that fun horizon for them to need to look to an exit in the next 24 to 36 months. So we will see. The other thing that I thought was interesting, number one, Ben Francis, the founder, still owns over 70% of the business, which he's kind of hinted along this decades long vision. And I think one thing that I want to note for other founders tuning in is that Ben was able to retain that much equity because he's only raised one round of funding, right? And that was very kind of later on into Gymshark's journey. I think you hear of so many brands now that start with VC funding and feel like they need to, raise to grow and kind of get on that VC treadmill. And, then you look at their cap table and very few of those founders own more than, even 40% of the business after a few rounds. And so I think, it's really just impressive to see how Ben Francis has maintained control of, his baby here, his, kind of just brand that he started in his parents' garage, right? And so it's just incredible to see what they've done. And they now have also a innovation lab. So they started this in 2024, which, I probably, as I saw this, I thought stemmed from people saying, hey, I want to, build products for Gymshark. I want to get involved here. And, I think any founder gets sent so many different cool softwares and product ideas that, they really kind of made this something called their innovation lab. And so they, share interests with people that are building cool technology, both in the apparel space as well as, through the supply chain space as well. And so I thought that was a great strategy for them to utilize in terms of, working with other creators and founders that are interested in, helping and growing with Gymshark.
Yeah. And I think the thing that just sticks out to me as we are going through this episode is this is a company that has done pretty much everything right. We didn't talk about any massive public issues, any sort of major supply chain problems, or just kind of a slump in revenue. They've really done a lot of good things right, and so it comes from this person who started something at 19. They took a step back. They were able to get the right team in place. They were profitable from the beginning. They grew quickly, but we're still organic in that growth. And it's been a really interesting thing. And I learned a lot from this episode, and is something I'm going to take back into my companies and the companies I work with.
Yeah, it's incredible. And, we appreciate everyone tuning in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. Subscribe, take a second, share it with a friend. If you have a friend in e-commerce and you haven't shared e-commerce on Tap with them yet, you are doing them a disfavor. So share this episode because I know they're going to want to know about Gymshark and just this incredible founding story. Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. And have a great rest of your morning or evening or whatever time zone you're in.